She was 51 years old. The winter she had nothing left but a wool coat gone thin at the elbows and $11 folded so many times the creases had worn soft as cloth. Her brother-in-law, Hollis Crane, had put her off the family land in the valley below Bitterroot Pass, Montana Territory, in the raw cold of 1889, claiming the deed had passed to him when her husband died and that a widow with no children was a burden a growing ranch could not carry. So Marta Ellsworth walked out of the only home she had known with those $11, and up on the Ridge Road, from a county clerk glad to be rid of it, she bought a lonely mountain watchtower, a crumbling stone signal post the army had abandoned 20 years before, for $9 and a promise to pay the tax. Folks said it was a fool's purchase, a pile of frozen rock where no sane soul would live. But behind the great stone fireplace of that tower, sealed and patient, something waited that would not only lift her out of ruin but call a whole scattered town back home. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marta Ellsworth. If you are watching tonight from some place the world seems to have forgotten, some valley or town or quiet room that time drove past without stopping, tell us in the comments where you are, so that we might remember you too. Marta was born Marta Vane in the year 1838, in a river town in Ohio where her father kept a small mason's yard and her mother took in fine sewing to fill the lean months. She grew up amid the smell of wet lime and cut stone, learning before she could properly read how a wall is only as honest as the man who lays it, how a stone set wrong will shed water inward and rot a house from its heart, and how a stone set true will stand 100 years and keep its secrets. Her father, a patient Cornish man named Edwin Vane, used to press her small hand flat against a finished wall and tell her to feel for the cold spots, the places where the mortar had not taken, because a builder who could feel a fault before it showed was worth 10 who only looked. She learned to read stone the way other children learn to read scripture, and she carried that gift the way some carry perfect pitch, quietly, hardly aware it made her rare. From her mother, a slight and unshakable woman named Josephine, she learned the second thing that would one day save her, which was the discipline of noticing. Josephine could take a coat some rich woman had discarded for a loose thread and see in it 3 good years of wear, could turn a frayed hem and reset a button and send a child to church in a garment that made the neighbors murmur. Nothing in that house was thrown away that still held use, and Marta grew up believing, in the marrow of her, that the world was full of value other people were too hurried or too proud to see. A cracked crock became a seed pot. A broken chair became kindling and then became a stool. Waste, her mother said, was only a failure of imagination. They were not rich, the Vanes, but they were whole, and Marta might have lived a small good life in that river town had the westering fever not taken hold of a young freighter named Thomas Ellsworth who came through with a wagon of Montana ore samples and a way of talking about the mountains as though they were a promise God had made to him personally. She married him at 22, against her father's gentle worry, and went west with him in a canvas-topped wagon, carrying her mother's needle case and her father's smallest mason's hammer wrapped in a flannel shirt, the only 2 inheritances she thought to bring and the only 2, as it turned out, she would ever need. The valley below Bitterroot Pass was greener than she had dared hope, a long trough of good grass hemmed by dark timbered ridges, and Thomas filed on a stretch of it and built them a cabin with his own hands and hers beside him. She laid the stone of their chimney herself, her father's hammer ringing in the thin bright air, and Thomas laughed and said she had married beneath her, that she ought to have been a builder of cathedrals instead of the wife of a poor rancher. But they were happy in the way of people who have exactly enough and know it. They ran a modest herd. They planted apple whips that took slowly in the cold. In the evenings Thomas read aloud from the few books they owned while Marta mended by the fire, and she thought, more than once, that her mother had been right, that a life could be built entirely out of things other people would have thrown away. They were not blessed with children, though they had prayed for them, and in time Marta made a kind of peace with the quiet of the house, filling it instead with usefulness, with the neighbors who came to her when a wall needed pointing or a hearth needed rebuilding, because word had gotten round that the Ellsworth woman could lay stone truer than any man in the county and would not overcharge a soul. She became, without meaning to, the person the valley leaned on. When the little town at the crossroads, a place called Halcyon, wanted a proper foundation under its meeting hall, it was Marta they asked, and she gave them a floor that would not heave in the frost, and they thanked her with pies and cured hams and a respect she wore lightly. She did not know then how quickly a place can forget who steadied it. She only knew the work, and the work was good, and she believed, in her steady way, that a life built honestly would be defended by the same hands it had helped. She was about to learn how wrong a good person can be about that. The fall, when it came the way winter comes to that country, not all at once but in a series of hardenings, each one seeming survivable until the sum of them was killing. Thomas took a fever in the autumn of 1888, a chest sickness that the valley doctor could not break, and for 3 weeks Marta nursed him with every remedy her mother had taught her, mustard and steam and broth and prayer, and for 3 weeks she watched the man who had promised her mountains grow smaller in their bed until one gray morning he was not there at all, only the shape of him, and the terrible quiet that follows a long labored breathing when it finally stops. She buried him on the rise behind the cabin where the apple whips had at last begun to bear, and she laid the fieldstones of his grave herself because she could not bear to let another hand do it clumsily. She had not known, in her grief, to fear the deed. Thomas had filed the land in his own name in the hurried way of the early days, and it had never once occurred to either of them that this mattered, that love and labor and 28 years of building were not, in the eyes of the territorial law, the same as a name written on a paper. But Hollis Crane knew. Hollis was Thomas's half-brother by a second marriage, a florid, calculating man who had drifted west 2 years before and settled at the valley's lower end, running cattle on shares and watching, always watching, the good deep grass of the Ellsworth place with the eyes of a man who counts what is not his. He came to the cabin not 2 months after the funeral, in his town coat, with a lawyer from Helena and a sheaf of documents, and he explained to Marta with a great show of sorrow that under the law the property reverted to the nearest male blood of the deceased, that the widow's dower was a courtesy the courts had grown reluctant to honor, and that he was, of course, prepared to be generous. Generous, it turned out, meant a seat at his table as an unpaid housekeeper for as long as she gave no trouble. Marta was 50 years old, strong still, clear-eyed, and she looked at Hollis Crane's soft hands and his hard little smile and understood that she was being offered not a home but a slow erasure. She fought it as best a woman could in that time and that place. She rode to Halcyon and stood in the county office and laid out her claim, that she had built the chimney and pointed every wall, that she had put the foundation under the very town hall in which they now stood arguing, that surely the labor of a lifetime counted for something. And the men there looked at their boots, and some of them had eaten her pies, and 1 or 2 had held their hats when she gave them a hearth that would not smoke, and every one of them told her, gently or not, that the law was the law and Hollis Crane held the paper. She learned then how a community can love a person and abandon her in the same breath, not out of malice but out of the ordinary cowardice of people who fear to be next. Hollis, it happened, held the notes on half of Halcyon besides, having bought up debts through the lean years, and no man there could afford to cross him. So one by one they let her go. She would not take his charity, would not sit at his table and be slowly unmade, and so on a bitter morning in the first week of 1889 she packed her mother's needle case and her father's small hammer and the thin wool coat and the $11 that were all Hollis had grudgingly allowed her, calling it a settlement, and she walked out of the valley she had built with her own 2 hands. She had nowhere to go, and pride enough not to beg, and it was the county clerk, a decent tired man named Alvin Peary who had always been ashamed of the whole business, who mentioned, half as a joke and half as the only kindness in his power, that the county held title to an old army watchtower up on the shoulder of the pass, a stone thing the soldiers had thrown up during the Indian scares of the 60s and abandoned when the danger passed, and that the county would as soon sell it to anyone fool enough to want it, tax and all, just to be shut of the liability. $9, he said, and the back tax she could work off in time, and he said it looking at his ledger because he could not look at her. And Marta, who had learned at her mother's knee that the world is full of value other people are too proud to see, counted out 9 of her $11 and bought herself a ruin on a mountain, because a ruin she owned was worth more than a warm room in which she was nothing. The watchtower stood at the end of a rutted trace that climbed 2 miles above the last homestead, a round drum of gray fieldstone some 30 feet high with a conical roof half fallen in, a single iron-strap door swollen shut in its frame, and narrow slitted windows through which the wind came like a thin knife. When Marta first put her shoulder to that door and forced it groaning inward, a drift of old snow slid across the flagstone floor and the whole place breathed at her, cold and mineral and long undisturbed, smelling of stone dust and packrat and the faint ghost of wood smoke 20 years gone. There was a ruined cot, a broken table, the rusted remains of a stove, and against the north wall a great fireplace of dressed stone, blackened at the throat, with a mantle of a single squared timber gone silver with age. Anyone else would have wept at the desolation of it. Marta set down her bundle, took off her thin coat despite the cold so as to work more freely, and did what her father had taught her to do before she did anything else, which was to walk the walls with her bare hand pressed flat against them, feeling for the cold spots, reading the stone. And what she read, that first afternoon, was that the tower was better built than it had any right to be, that some army engineer had known his trade, that the walls were sound and the mortar mostly good, and that with labor and time this pile of frozen rock could be made not merely to shelter her but to hold heat, to stand, to be a home. She had, in $11 and a fool's purchase, acquired the one thing on earth she truly understood, and for the first time since Thomas died she felt something loosen in her chest that was not quite hope but was its near cousin, the plain animal satisfaction of having good work to do. She slept that first night by a small fire coaxed from fallen roof timbers, and in the morning she began at the fireplace, because a hearth is the heart of any house and because the great chimney, she suspected, was where the tower's heat was leaking away. It was as she knelt at that fireplace, running her hand along the firebox to find the fault, that she felt it, the thing her whole childhood had trained her to notice, a cold spot where no cold spot should be. At the back of the hearth, behind the blackened stones, the wall breathed cold, the unmistakable draw of an empty space where solid backing ought to be. Someone, she understood at once, had walled off a cavity behind that fireplace and disguised the work so cunningly that only a builder's hand, feeling for a builder's lie, would ever have found it. Her heart went very quiet and very fast at the same time. She fetched her father's small hammer from her bundle, wrapped her hand in a fold of her coat, and began, gently, patiently, to search out the seam. It took her the better part of 2 days to open that hidden place, working in the guttering light, tapping and listening the way her father had taught her, prying each stone free without shattering it and laying it aside in order so that she might close the wall again if what she found was nothing. But it was not nothing. Behind the false backing of the fireplace, in a dry cavity the size of a bread oven, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff as board, she found a flat tin dispatch box of the kind the army issued its officers, and beside it, standing upright against the stone, a long object swaddled in a blanket that fell to dust when she touched it, and behind them both, so faint she nearly missed it in the dimness, words scratched into the flat inner stone by a knife point, patient and deep. I leave this for whoever loves this mountain enough to mend it. God grant that be a better soul than took it from us. Marta sat back on her heels in the cold and read those words 3 times, and something in them reached across 20 years and took hold of her, because she was, she thought, exactly that soul, a person who had come to this mountain not to plunder it but to mend it, and it seemed to her almost unbearable that a stranger long dead had known she would come. She opened the tin box with trembling fingers. Inside, kept dry and whole by the mason's cunning of the cavity, lay a bundle of papers tied in faded ribbon, a small leather journal, and a folded map drawn in a fine engineer's hand. And as she read, by firelight, over that first long night and the many nights after, the story of the man who had sealed the wall came to her piece by piece, and with it the shape of a secret far larger than her own small ruin. The journal belonged to a Sergeant Elias Warwick of the Army Corps of Engineers, who had built the tower in 1867 and had stayed on after his company withdrew, discharged and half forgotten, a man who had fallen in love with the mountain. And could not leave it. But Warwick, the papers revealed, had not been merely a soldier. Before the war he had been a surveyor for the Territorial Land Office, and in his wandering of the ridges above Bitterroot Pass he had found something the hurried gold seekers of the region, forever scrabbling in the creek gravels below, had entirely overlooked. High on the north face, in a seam of quartz no prospector had thought to climb to, Warwick had traced a lode of silver, not a rich man's dream of it but the real and provable thing, and he had done what a careful engineer does, which was to map it precisely, to record the assays, and to file, quietly and legally, the mineral claims that secured it, 12 claims in all, staked and recorded in the territorial office under his own name in the autumn of 1868. But Elias Warwick had been a dying man even as he sealed the wall. The journal's later pages, in a hand grown shaky, spoke of a cough that would not leave him, of blood on his handkerchief, of a growing certainty that he would not live to see another spring. He had no wife, no children, no living kin that he knew of. And he had watched, in his years on the mountain, the way silver strikes destroyed the very places they blessed, the way men murdered brothers over stakes and towns bloomed into vice and violence and died again in a decade, leaving nothing but poisoned creeks and empty saloons and graves. And so Warwick had made a strange and beautiful decision. He would not sell his claims to speculators. He would not tell the world. He would seal the proof of the lode behind the hearth of the tower he had built, along with the recorded deeds and the map, and he would leave it for time and providence to deliver into the hands of someone who would use it rightly, someone who loved the mountain enough to mend the tower and thereby prove the quality of their soul before ever they knew what waited inside. It was, Marta understood, the wager of a lonely and honorable man against the greed of the world, and she had, without knowing it, won it. The long object in the blanket was a surveyor's transit, Warwick's own, its brass gone green but its lenses whole, and with it, folded small, a letter that was less a legal document than a benediction. In it Warwick set out, in the plain formal language of a man who had made his peace, that whosoever should find these papers, having first restored the tower and thereby shown themselves a mender and not a spoiler, should be considered by all the honor he possessed as the rightful heir to his claims, and he had, astonishingly, thought even of that, for tucked into the letter was a second document, witnessed and notarized by a magistrate in Deer Lodge in 1869, a deed of conditional assignment. Leaving the entirety of the Warwick claims to the bearer of the letter, a legal instrument as strange and as sound as the man who had drawn it. Marta held in her chapped hands that night in the tower, the proof of a fortune in silver. And, harder to credit, the legal right to it, left to her across 2 decades by a dead stranger who had asked only that she love the mountain first. She did not go mad with it, as a smaller soul might have. She sat with it a long while, and she thought of her mother turning a rich woman's cast-off coat into 3 good years of wear, and she thought that this was only the same lesson written in silver, that the world was full of value the proud and hurried overlooked, and that the finding of it laid an obligation on the finder. But she also understood, being no fool, that a widow of 51 with a notarized deed and a mountain of silver was in far greater danger than a widow with $11 had ever been, and that the first man who would try to take it from her was the very man who had already taken everything else, if only he learned it existed. So she told no one. She mended the tower stone by stone through that long winter, working the claims a little in secret when the weather allowed, packing out or samples under her firewood, and quietly, patiently, she began to make herself ready, because she knew that the fight was coming, and she intended, this time, to be standing on ground that was truly her own. Word of a strike cannot be hidden forever, and it was not silver that betrayed her but stone, for Marta, needing an assay she could trust, made the long journey down to Halcyon and thence to the assay office in the county seat, and though she gave a false name and paid in the last of her coin, the assayer was a talkative man and the sample was rich, and in a country starved for good news the rumor traveled faster than she could ride home. A woman up on the pass, they said. The old army tower. Silver. And it did not take 3 days for that rumor to reach the soft calculating ears of Hollis Crane, who sat up very straight at his brother's stolen table and remembered, with a slow spreading smile, exactly who it was he had run up onto that worthless mountain. He came for her as he had come before, in his town coat with a lawyer at his side, but this time there was nothing sorrowful in his manner, only the hard bright appetite of a man who scents a fortune. He climbed to the tower on a raw April morning and found Marta at the wall with her father's hammer in her hand, and he told her, expansively, that he had come to help her, that a woman alone could not possibly work a mineral claim, that as her late husband's brother and nearest kin he had both the right and the duty to manage the property, and that he was prepared, generous as ever, to see her comfortably kept in exchange for signing the working of the claims over to him. And when she said no, quietly, he let the mask fall entirely and told her the truth of his position, which was that the tower stood on land whose survey lines had never been perfectly settled, that he had already spoken to men at the land office who owed him money, that he could tie her claim in litigation for 10 years and starve her out of it, that she was an old woman with no money and no friends and no name on any paper that mattered, and that she would take his offer or she would get nothing, exactly as before. It was a fair account of her weakness, and Marta knew it. She had the Warwick deed, but a deed 20 years old, assigned in so unusual a manner, would be meet for lawyers, and Hollis had the lawyers and the money and the patience and the friends in low places, and she had a hammer and a mountain and $11 less 9. For a long moment, standing in the cold shadow of the tower she had rebuilt, she felt the old despair reach for her, the same grey certainty that had walked her out of the valley the year before, the knowledge that the law and the money and the men would side, as they always sided, with the one who held the paper and against the one who had merely done the work. But she was not the same woman who had walked out of the valley. She had spent a winter alone on a mountain reading the journal of a man who had faced the whole greed of the world and refused to feed it, and something of Elias Warwick's stubborn honor had gotten into her along with the cold. She looked at Hollis Crane, and she saw not a power but a pattern, a man who took what others built because he could not build, who held debts over a whole town because he could not earn its love, and she understood at last the true shape of the wager Warwick had made and the true nature of the weapon he had left her. It was not the silver. The silver was only the bait. The weapon was the town itself, the town of Halcyon that owed Hollis Crane money and hated him for it, the town that had let her go out of fear and had eaten her pies and stood on the foundation she had laid, the town that needed exactly one thing to find its courage, which was a reason to hope it might win. And she, alone among all of them, now held that reason in a tin box behind her hearth. So Marta Ellsworth did the thing that Hollis Crane, who understood only greed, could never have predicted, which was to give the fortune away before he could steal it. She told him no a second time, and she watched him ride down the mountain promising ruin, and then she saddled her old mare and rode down after him, but not to his door. She rode to Halcyon, to the meeting hall that stood on the foundation she had built with her own hands, and she called the town together, every homesteader and shopkeeper and freighter and debtor of them, and she stood on the floor she had laid and she told them everything. She told them of Warwick and his claims and his beautiful stubborn wager. She showed them the map and the essays and the notarized deed. And then she made them an offer that no one in that hall had ever heard the like of, an offer that came straight out of a mason's yard in Ohio and a slight unshakable woman turning cast-off coats into years of warmth. The silver, she said, was legally hers, proven and deeded, and she meant to keep it hers in law so that no Hollis Crane could ever wrest it away. But she did not intend to work it as one greedy soul among many, tearing the mountain and poisoning the creeks and building a town that would die in a decade the way Warwick had watched other towns die. Instead she would form a company owned in shares by the people of Halcyon itself, every family a shareholder. The mountain worked slowly and carefully under her own eye as the one person there who could read stone and knew what Warwick had wanted. The proceeds paid out first to buy up and cancel every debt Hollis Crane held over the town, so that no family there would ever again let a neighbor be cast out for fear of being next. She would take a single share, the same as any of them, and she would live in the tower and mend it, and the mountain that a dead man had loved would at last belong to people who loved it too. And the hall, which had been silent, rose to her in a sound she would remember to the end of her days, the sound of a forgotten place remembering it was worth defending. Hollis Crane fought it, of course, with every lawyer and false survey and whispered threat he owned, but a man's power is only the fear he inspires, and Marta had cured the town of its fear in a single afternoon by giving it something better to hold. When the debts he had counted on to starve his neighbors were bought up and burned in the stove of the meeting hall, when the whole of Halcyon stood as witnesses to the age and the honesty of the Warwick deed, when lawyers of their own, hired with the first honest silver of the claims, laid Warwick's notarized assignment before a territorial judge who had himself watched greed murder better towns, the paper that Hollis held became what Marta's labor had always truly been worth, and his crumbled to nothing in the same courtroom. He was not hanged and he was not beaten, for that was never the shape of justice in her story. He was simply, quietly, unmade, his mortgages gone, his borrowed power dissolved, his stolen valley worth less every year as the honest prosperity of the Tower Company flowed to everyone but him, until at last he sold the Ellsworth land back to the very company Marta had built, for a fair price and not a penny more, and drifted on west to some other valley, a small man who had learned too late that you cannot hold what you did not build. And Marta, they say, bought back the cabin she had raised with Thomas and gave it to a young homesteading family with children, because a house that had never held children had waited long enough. She was 51 years old the winter she had nothing left but a thin wool coat and $11 folded soft as cloth, cast out of the valley she had built by a man who held the paper while she had only done the work, and she spent 9 of those $11 on a lonely mountain watchtower that every sane soul in the county called a fool's ruin. And behind the great stone fireplace of that ruin, sealed 20 years by the honor of a dying stranger, waited the answer she never expected, which turned out not to be silver at all, though there was silver, but the plain and staggering proof of what her mother had taught her at the mending basket and her father had taught her with his hand pressed flat against the stone, that the world is forever full of value the proud and the hurried throw away, and that it waits, patient as a walled-up hearth, for the one soul with the eyes to see it and the hands to mend it and the heart to share it out. Marta Ellsworth did not become the richest woman in Montana Territory, though she could have. She became something the country had far more need of and far less of, a mender of a broken place, and the town of Halcyon, which had once let her walk away in the cold, grew old around her and never once forgot again who it was that steadied it, nor what it costs a community to abandon the very people who hold it up. Thank you for sitting with us tonight, for climbing that rutted trace in the cold and standing in the tower while the fire caught and the old stones gave up their secret. If Marta's story warms something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being cast aside is not the same as being worthless, that the fool's purchase and the forgotten ruin and the overlooked soul may be carrying, sealed and patient, the very answer a whole community is waiting for. And before you go, let us leave you with one question to carry into your own quiet hours. What is a time in your life when you found real and lasting value in something, or someone, that others had written off, and what did the finding of it ask of you in return? Tell us in the comments, and stay a while with us here where the forgotten are remembered. Until next time, stay close.